Hello, everyone. This is Professor Gabriel Selassie, and today what we're going to cover are key concepts that you're going to have to know for this African American Studies political course. Now, the concepts that we're going to go over are just some basic politics, things that you would ordinarily learn in a political science class. This class, although it deals specifically with African Americans in politics, we are obliged to give you some information that you would normally have in a regular politics course. So you get the direct benefit of being able to delve into Black politics, but also satisfy the requirement for political science with this course. That's why this course is a really good one, because it helps you to satisfy two fundamental things. One, your political science, and the other, because you're probably all interested in Black politics, it necessarily aids in that, and you'll learn, I think, in this course quite a number of things about Black politics. So let us go ahead and cue up the presentation here and let us get going. All right, so what we're going to do is talk about some key concepts and key terms that specifically relate to American government. So the first basic thing that you should know is that we have three branches of government in the United States. We have a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. The legislative branch is responsible for writing the laws of the United States. Now, sometimes you can have laws written or proposed by the executive branch and given over to the legislative branch, but that's a much more complicated process that we may or may not get into in this lecture. When I get to the executive branch and start talking about it, I may cover it there, but if not, the principal group that is responsible for writing laws is the legislative branch. Within the legislative branch, you have two houses. One of them is called the House of Representatives, and the other one is called the Senate, and they are two very different bodies. We also have the executive branch, which here in this diagram you show as the White House, and the head of the executive branch is the President of the United States, followed by a vice president who their initial job is, if something happens to the president, that they can step in to be president. Over time, I would imagine, since really with the rise of Bill Clinton, when he came into office, Al Gore worked quite a bit with President Clinton and kind of changed the very nature of that job, where vice presidents, what they used to do is basically nothing. Many people believe that if you were ever nominated and asked to be a vice president, that was a sign that they wanted to basically get you out of politics. And why that is because what would happen is that you would basically do nothing. You had no duties. You had maybe a little staff of something, but you basically just didn't do anything. You went back to your house and you just kind of sat around and just waited until you were called upon by the president, and the presidents rarely ever kept the vice presidents in the loop. I'll give an example to this. When Franklin Roosevelt died, Franklin Roosevelt was the president during World War II. His vice president was Harry S. Truman. When Roosevelt died I believe in 1945, they were getting ready to make the decision on whether or not to drop the atomic bombs on Japan. Harry Truman did not even realize we had a nuclear program. That's how far the vice president was kept out of the loop. So from this perspective, you can see that today the nature of the vice presidency has changed dramatically, where vice presidents now are given tasks, they have bigger staffs, they actually take a role, whatever the role that the president wants them to take, in helping to run the executive branch. Then we have the judicial branch, which the top court is the Supreme Court, and we have lesser federal courts and state courts in the United States. So we have a two-court system, one where you have state courts, and then one where you have federal courts, and they all fall under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the land. So we have a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. So let's delve in just a little bit more closely on the executive branch. The head of the executive branch is a president, and they are a civilian. They are like a chief executive in many ways, like you could kind of say in some ways like the owner of a business. They control the federal government. They have no jurisdiction within state governments, but they control the branches of government within the executive branch. So there is a office of education, there is an office of housing. These are all departments. There's a Treasury Department, there is a Environmental Protection Agency, there is NASA, the space program. You have lots of departments that fit under the executive branch, and the president is responsible for the running of those departments that fit under the executive branch. Each one of those departments has a head, and they are normally selected by the president when they come into office. Some of them, which are quite smaller, career people work in them, but the larger ones are run by people that are appointed by the President of the United States. He controls those, or she, whenever we are going to have, and I think this is going to be somewhere in our future, a female president, which would be a good thing. We also put under the president the control of the U.S. military. So in the United States, a civilian is head of the military. They call the president a commander-in-chief. So we have in the United States a merchant marine, a Coast Guard, a Navy, an Air Force, an Army, and a Marine Corps. And now we have a space branch, which I don't know how long will last, but we have that. Each one of those is run by a person within the military. But the president, as the commander-in-chief, is in control of the military and can remove members of the military at any point. I was an officer in the United States Army, and I received my commission as an officer from the President of the United States. He actually had to sign a document that stated that I was a commissioned officer. The head of the Army also signed it, but unless the president gives blessing for that commission, you will not get one. And the recommendations are made to the president, and the president signs a document saying, okay, all of these people who've been recommended are now commissioned officers. But that goes to show you the level of control that the president has over the military. The president is elected every 4 years and serves a 4-year term. Now, a president can serve 2 successive terms. So they could literally serve 8 years. Before the 1950s, presidents could serve as many terms as they wished. So, for example, Franklin Roosevelt served, I believe, 4 terms. He died in his last term, but if he lived longer, he would have kept running for president. There was no law that stated that a president could only serve 8 years. Now, the reason why Franklin Roosevelt was the only person to ever serve more than 8-year term is because he was a beloved president. It was the Great Depression that hit the United States in 1929. The United States, and the world went to war in the 1940s. And so people just kind of felt that the best person to do the job was Roosevelt. He was an extremely popular president. But after Roosevelt died, the United States just kind of said, you know what, we can't have people serving for life, so we'll limit it to 8 years maximum. Now, the reason why no one ever kept running for president more than 2 terms before then is because when Washington was elected president, they literally told him that if he wanted to serve as president for life, they would allow him. And he said that no president should serve more than 8 years. And so people just kind of followed Washington's lead and only served 2 terms maximum. Now, as we stated earlier, the vice president is the co-executive and has a special duty. The vice president is actually the head of the U.S. Senate, but doesn't function in the U.S. Senate unless there is a tie vote. If there is a tie vote, they call the vice president over to vote, and he will or she will break the tie. That's the only real function that the vice president has. And as I said before, if something happens to the president, the vice president will take over. The president of the United States is Donald Trump, and the vice president is Mike Pence. This is the White House. What is interesting about the White House is, for one, the name, because this house was literally built by slaves. But nevertheless, they do give tours of the White House, and sometimes they call it the People's House. There are certain rooms that you can't go in, but just pretty much basically, you can get tours of the White House. It is open to the public. There used to be a point in the United States where there was no fence around the White House, and you could just literally walk up to the White House and knock on the door and somebody would open it. Over time, they kind of realized because of security reasons that wasn't a good idea. So they fenced it off, and of course there are FBI and Secret Service people all around the White House these days. Now the legislative branch. Now, we have 2 branches in the legislative branch, and they are called co-equal branches. And this gets a little bit complicated, so I'm hoping that you're going to be able to stay with me on this. The first house is called the House of Representatives. People who are in the House of Representatives are called congressmen or congresswomen. Now, that's funny because Congress has 2 branches, but they only call those members who serve in the House of Representatives congressmen or congresswomen. Congresswomen and congressmen have to run for office every 2 years. Why 2 years? It was thought at the time of the framing of the Constitution that the House of Representatives would be the people's house. And therefore, what they wanted is to try to make it so many different people had an opportunity to serve in Congress. So they said, we'll limit it to 2 years. So what this means is that every 2 years, you basically are in a fight to stay in Congress. Now, the House of Representatives is known again as the People's House, and their main role is to represent the people within their congressional district. Each state has representatives based on the population of that state. So if your state is very populated, that state will get more members of the House of Representatives. The smaller the state, the less number of members of the House of Representatives. They do a census, figure out how many people are in each state, and apportion the number of representatives based on the state's population. So the most populated state in the United States is California. So we have the most members of the House of Representatives. So California, by and large, basically controls the House of Representatives. New York, Florida, and Texas are other big states with large populations, and so they have numbers, a good fair amount of members of the House of Representatives as well. The total number of members within the House of Representatives are 435, and this was fixed in 1929. States can either gain or lose members, but that number since 1929 never changes. The reason for that is that if the United States population kept getting larger, the House of Representatives would just be so large that you could not know everybody and there would be no seats. Right now, if you go into the House of Representatives, there are not 435 chairs, right? So that is problematic. So sometimes members of the House get to sit in and sometimes they don't. Now, the person that runs the House of Representatives is called the Speaker of the House, and they probably are the second most powerful person in America. You probably would think to yourself that the Vice President might be the second most powerful person in America, but that isn't true because the Vice President only has one duty, and that is to break the tie in the U.S. Senate. So they have no power. That's the only time they get to exercise any amount of power at all to break ties. So why is the Speaker of the House the second most popular person in America? Well, the founders kind of thought that since the House of Representatives would be the people's house, that they gave the House of Representatives the power to apportion all of the money in the United States. So whoever is the Speaker of the House gets to appoint members to a committee that actually have to sit down and figure out where all the money goes. So the Speaker of the House today is Nancy Pelosi from California. She gets to determine who is going to sit on the House Ways and Means Committee, and that committee largely determines where money is going. There is an untold number of money that gets pushed around in the United States, and they get to decide. Now, so if you are, let's just hypothetically say, living in Illinois, and you need money to build a road in your town, you can go to the House Speaker and say, look, I need help. I need money for a road for my town. And you can strike a bargain with that speaker to get money for your city. That makes the Speaker of the House very important. The President of the United States can make suggestions, and they do have access to some money, but the vast majority of all the money sits with the House of Representatives. The Speaker of the House of Representatives is elected by members of Congress. So you can see that since California has about 53 or so members of the House of Representatives, they have a larger say in who becomes Speaker of the House. Here is a map that kind of shows you the numbers of members of the House of Representatives. So you can see California has a large number, followed by states like Texas, Florida, and New York, Pennsylvania. Smaller states like Rhode Island, Delaware, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Idaho have very few members of the House of Representatives. Now, what makes things really interesting is look at Wyoming. Wyoming's lone member is a very powerful person in that state because that member is the only person that sits in Congress. So people in Wyoming have to always know who their congressperson is and pay homage to that person. But in California, there are so many members of the House that you might get lost in the shuffle. Right? So, and it also makes things much harder if you are a member of the House of Representatives from Montana, because you have to worry about the entire state, whereas people in California only have to worry about their congressional districts. So let's take a look at some of these congressional districts. So take a look at California. California has quite a number of congressional districts. But if you looked at Nevada or Montana, Colorado, they have one congressional district. Look at Florida, all the way to the right, down at the bottom, they have quite a number. Or Texas. California has quite a number. So the states are broken up into congressional districts by a process that we call gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is pronounced like the name Gary, but it's spelled Gerry. So it looks like gerrymandering, but it's actually gerrymandering. So what happens here is that politicians within the state carve up the state into districts. Who gets to do that? Whatever the political party that controls the state gets to do that. So in California, Democrats control, so they get to do that. In Texas, Republicans control, so they get to do that. So what they're trying to always do is carve up the state so they can get more members from their party. That's why these congressional districts look so funny with all these weird shapes, because they're excluding and including people. They're also trying to do things like make sure that Black communities have members, Latino communities have members, etc. So what they're trying to do in some ways is to exclude people from the other party and also include minorities. So there will be some minority representation in congressional districts. That's essentially how it happens. The other branch is the U.S. Senate, and members of the U.S. Senate are simply called senator. Each state gets 2 senators. So no matter what the population is for that state, they still get 2 senators. What is the duty of a senator? A senator's entire job is to look out for the state as a whole. Members of Congress have to look out for the people in their congressional districts, but senators have to look out for the entire state. So their focus is not on small areas, but the entire state. Senators run for office every 6 years. Why 6 years? They kind of knew, the founders that is, that the House of Representatives would be sort of like a swinging door, that people would be coming in, or at least the idea was that people would be coming in and out so fast that it would take time for people to get adjusted and to learn things. And then as soon as they learn things, they would be out. Or it just would take them forever to gain seniority. Like you keep getting elected, but it takes time to get seniority. So they decided to create a body where people would be more stable. You're in for the long haul as a senator. So what this means is that the senators have more power than the congressmen. Now, let me say that in a way that'll make better sense. The House of Representatives is much more powerful as a body than the Senate. But individual senators are much more powerful than individual members of the House. If you are a member of the House of Representatives, you are just one of 400 and some odd members. You're lost in the crowd. However, there are only 100 elected senators, 2 from each state. So everybody knows you. When you walk around Washington, D.C. as a senator, people will open doors for you. You'll get a good table at a restaurant. People know who you are. However, if you are a member of Congress, nobody knows your face. Nobody is opening any doors for you. Nobody cares. The only person that people will recognize is the Speaker of the House. But by and large, nobody's going to care about you if you're a member of Congress. That's just the way things go. You're going to have a small office with a small staff. But a U.S. senator has some real power. And this is what your power is. You have the power to filibuster. What is a filibuster? A filibuster is the ability to stop any bill from becoming law. So after the House of Representatives passes the law, they send it over to the Senate. They vote on it. And if it passes the Senate, they send it over to the president to be signed into law. If the House of Representatives pass a bill, then they send it over to the Senate. And you as a senator don't like the bill, you can automatically stop it. It'll never come before the floor of the Senate to be voted on. That's what gives you power. So what has to happen? If the House of Representatives wants a bill so badly and they have a fear that you might filibuster their bill, they can come over to you and say, what do you want? You need some money for a road to be built in your state? Here you go. Sign on to our bill. They're going to make a deal with you. Maybe you don't want the deal. You hate the bill so much that you just don't, no matter what they throw in front of you, you don't want it. The bill dies. But on the other hand, if you do need money for that road and the bill comes before you that you don't like, the speaker can come over to you and say, I know you don't like this bill, but I'll give you money for that road. Maybe you'll just vote for it to get the road that you want. Compromise. The whole foundation of government in the United States was built on compromise. When compromise doesn't work, we get civil wars. Compromise is a good thing. You have to compromise everything. You want a college degree? You got to come to class. You got to sit in the class. You got to take the exams. It's a compromise. It's a trade-off. The whole world works in compromise. That's how we get along. When compromise fails, bad things happen, and usually who suffers are the people. This is the U.S. Capitol building, where the members of Congress serve. The judicial branch. Judges. The U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has 8 associate justices and 1 chief justice, and they serve for life. What do? The main function of the U.S. Supreme Court is to determine that laws are consistent with the Constitution. Let's say that Congress passes a bill and the president signs it into law. But you, as a citizen, don't like the law. You say that it's wrong. You can sue the government. Your court case will go to federal court, and a lower federal court will hear your case. And if they say, sorry, we think the law is fine, you lose. But if you lose, you can appeal the case to a higher court. If you lose again, you can appeal it to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court could hear your case and say, you know what? We think those lower courts were wrong. We think that you're right, and we strike down the law. Or they could say, those lower courts got it exactly right. That's what their job is, to determine if laws are consistent with the U.S. Constitution. This is the current U.S. Supreme Court. Now, in the United States, we have state governments. We have 50 states, and each state has its own government. So we have a federal government with the president, the vice president. Then we have a U.S. House of Representatives and a U.S. Senate. That's federal government. Now we have state governments that in many ways mirror the federal government. We have 50 governors who act in many ways a chief executive, like the president. Each state has its own constitution. Each state has its own Supreme Court that hears whether or not state laws are in violation or not of its own state constitution. We have legislative bodies just like the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives, and typically what they're called are assemblies and state senates. Their job is to make laws for each state, just like the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. There is the governor of California, Gavin Newsom. Just like we have districts for congressmen, we have the same thing, districts for state office as well in California and the assembly. Now, one other area that you need to have some fundamental understanding, because we talk a lot about the two-party system we have in the United States, the Democrats and the Republicans. So you ought to have some basic background about political parties. Now, what is a political party? It's essentially a group of persons organized to acquire and exercise political power. That's all a political party is. It's just a group of people that organize themselves with the hope of gaining political power. You can start a political party. Doesn't mean anybody's going to join it, but you can actually start one. In the United States, we began with one party, and that was the Federalist Party, founded by Alexander Hamilton. Every person who was there at the founding of America considered themselves to be Federalists because we had a Federalist system. There were some people who didn't necessarily like the Federalist Party, and we'll see that in just one moment, but nevertheless, they were all part of the same Federalist Party. The second party to emerge in the United States was called the Democratic Republican Party, founded by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. This party was formed to oppose the Federalist Party because they thought that the Federalist Party was usurping too much political power and leading the nation in the wrong direction. The Democratic Republican Party was founded in 1792, and it would later become the Democratic Party that we know of today. But this Democratic Party, founded by Jefferson and James Madison, started out being a radical party, but later morphed into an extremely conservative party. And then today, as we have it, they've morphed back into a liberal party. Of course, the Democratic Republican Party is going to drop the name Republican Party at some particular point, and that name, the Republican Party, will be picked up later by another group. By 1824 to 1854, we entered into the second party system. So the first party system was the Federalist and the Democratic Republicans. We enter into a phase called the second party system between 1824 and 1854 with a rise of a large number of small parties with different ideologies. For example, the Anti-Masonic Party was formed in 1828 to end the influence of the Masons. We had the Free Soil Party was founded in 1846. They were founded by people who were either against slavery or were trying to exclude slavery from certain parts of the territories that were opening up to the United States. So some members of the Democratic Party broke off and formed the Free Soil Party. In 1832, another party was founded called the Whig Party. The Whig Party was founded to oppose Andrew Jackson and the Democratic Party. They believed that Andrew Jackson was trying to usurp and become king, and this party was formed. This party was made up of wealthy Northerners and very wealthy plantation owners in the South, and their party would be destroyed in 1856 over arguments over slavery. Members of the Whig Party joined the Know-Nothing Party or the Republican Party, which was formed later. There was a Nativist or American Party in 1854 to 1856. They were called the Know-Nothings. This was an extremely racist party, and some people argued that it was America's first racist party. And why Know-Nothings? Well, people would ask them if they belonged to the American Party, and what they would shout back is, "I know nothing." So they got to be known as the Know-Nothings. Their goal was to purify American politics by ridding the nation of immigrants. They were anti-Catholic, they disliked Germans and Irish, and they worked to end immigration into the United States. They nominated Millard Fillmore in 1856. There was the Liberty Party, which was founded in 1840. It advocated the emancipation of slaves. The Republican Party was active from 1820 to 1832, and that party collapsed. The National Union Party was formed in 1864 to 1869. And this party changed its name later on to the Republican Party, and that is the Republican Party that we know of today. Its main focus was to end slavery. But again, I emphasize the Republican Party of Lincoln was a radical leftist party. The Republican Party today is a conservative party. Now we need to talk about this idea that we call the state. And I don't mean individual states. The state is a concept. So you might have heard somebody say one time, they're exercising state power. That is the state. Or a person says they are the Secretary of State. What does that mean? So we're going to define for you here what the state is. The state is, according to 19th century German philosopher Max Weber, it is that entity that has the sole right to use violence. They are the armed forces, the police, and the court system. They make up the state. The state exists because without the sole right to use violence, anarchy would break out. We can think of this everywhere in Asia, Lebanon, Palestine, Africa, anywhere where you have the state collapsing, you will probably have violence. So when we say the right to use violence, if you go into the military, you become a police officer, or you're a steward of the court, like, for example, if you're a judge and you get to convict somebody and sentence them to die, capital punishment, you are part of the state. And the state definitely has a bureaucracy. All populations must become subordinate of the state. When citizens decide that they no longer want to be part of a country, they can rebel. And what they're rebelling against is the state. Because what will happen likely is that the government will send the state and exercise state power to put down the rebellion. Taxes are important. You ought to know what taxes are. Taxes are also sometimes known as duties. They're collected by a government agency, and ours is the Internal Revenue Service. Why do we collect taxes? Because we need to pay for things like the state. We need to do things also like build infrastructure, roads. We need to build sewer systems, all sorts of things. We need to give money for education and health care. This is why we collect taxes. There are different kinds of tax like sales, property, income, inheritance, and excise taxes. All different kinds of things. You can pay your taxes by money or sometimes even through indirect labor. So you work and you get your money and they taken out taxes. By the virtue of you working, you have to pay a payroll tax or an income tax, right? So it's either direct or indirect. Now, politics has a theory. It has a process, and we'll talk about that in another lecture, but there is a political theory or political philosophy. Political theory or political philosophy means that one is engaged with current political issues and is self-reflective about political life. So you're engaging in political theory or political philosophy when you sit down and you discuss politics with other people, or you're reading politics, thinking about politics. You're engaged in political theory. Professors who teach political science study the science of politics. How does politics work? And we'll talk about this when we get to the political process. So when you're engaged with political theory, you're looking at things like liberty, justice, property, rights, law, enforcement of the legal code by authority. Some of the questions that you might ask are, what legal right should be protected and why? What form should it take and why? Does everything need to be covered by a law? That's a good question that you might ask in a political theory discussion. What the law is, and what duty do citizens owe to legitimate governments? These are all questions of political theory. So almost any question that you can kind of think of that relates to politics can be addressed in political theory. Okay, everyone, that's the end of our lecture. If you have any questions, feel free to send me a message.